America. Welcome to the Junto Podcast, where we promote the practical applications of critical thinking and bold creativity. I am your host, Edgar Mills. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to episode 12, good people. Thanks for coming back. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the continued support. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about some political figures from the 1800s, political philosophers. They indeed were not American political figures at all. Both happen to be French. I know that sounds odd, but I'm going to lay it on you. And the reason I felt compelled to do this episode is that a lot of people, I talk about libertarianism a lot, the Libertarian Party, but libertarian ideals and libertarian politics. And many people don't know the foundations of libertarianism. And you could probably compare libertarianism of today to what would have been called classical liberalism, in the 1800s. So there's a couple of figures that I want to highlight. I'll do a little compare and contrast, and then kind of juxtapose their philosophies with modern politics and how their philosophies could either how they hold up and possibly how they could help us or if not. So hopefully many of you have not only heard of Frédéric Bastiat, but have read The Law. He wrote a paper, and I want to say he wrote the paper it was published in 1850. I want to say he wrote it during the French Revolution, 1848 or 1849. But Frédéric Bastiat, he was a French economist. He was a political philosopher, and he was a strong proponent of limited government and individual liberty. Now, for those of you who are savvy to libertarian politics, you know that those two things right there are dead on. So he believed that, there's a few core principles. So let me get to the core principles of the law, and that's what the paper was called, The Law. Bastiat believed that the law existed only to protect individual rights. That's life, liberty, and property. That anything that it did beyond that was unnecessary and lent itself to potential corruption. And he also thought that the law should be a negative, not a positive, as to say the law should be passive, and that if somebody has a grievance, then they go and take it up with a judge or whatnot, but that the law should not be out actively attempting to write law, change law. It should not be a proactive thing going after people, going after the individual. So that's an interesting way to look at that. Now we're so far beyond that these days, it's insane, but man, what could have been. One of the core principles of the law is Bastiat's critique of legal plunder. So let's define it. What is plunder? When the law is used to take from one group to benefit another, ergo wealth redistribution, subsidizing various businesses, etc. And some more examples of that. In today's world, this might seem very familiar. Tariffs are an example of legal plunder. Welfare programs, the government contracting system. These are all USAID. Now, there's a big controversy right now over Doge and Elon and Trump, having a little breakup. But the fact of the matter is USAID was used for plunder, legal plunder, for padding the pockets of, you name it, whoever. And then another core principle of the law was limited government. He very strongly advocated that the government should have very, very limited roles, and those roles simply to protect rights. Absolutely not to engineer society, not for social engineering, not for social experimentation, etc., etc. And then a part of those core principles is the moral foundation of the law. The law should align with natural rights. Now, you can call those natural rights from simply by existence. By existing, you have natural rights. And then those of us who believe in Jesus and believe in God, we believe those are endowed by our Maker, right? Either way, natural rights. The law should align with natural rights and obviously justice, right? There's no arbitrary power or there's no majority rule when it comes to the law. And I know some of the lefties are going to jump all over that because they love to talk about democracy, true democracy. But a true democracy, we'll get to that later when we talk about the next guy. Comparing Bastiat to modern politics is a little difficult as far as the good things go. That we are not in a limited government. There are people out there who advocate for limited government, but that's not what we have. We do, as a nation, I suppose we do still sort of respect property rights within the legal system, but you see that gets kind of crapped on. You see that there's riots in Los Angeles right now because of these ICE raids, and no one there cares one thing about property rights. But more importantly, I think he was talking about then was the individual property rights being safe from the government, right? From the centralized government and doing eminent domain or things like that. Or these days you see a lot of asset forfeiture from somebody who's charged with a crime. And then the government takes everything they have based on that. And then there are still small groups out there who vocally resist, over-regulation in business or even personal freedoms. You see an assault on free speech these days. People, extreme groups, right? Activists are out there trying to define what is and isn't free speech based on what they like and what they think. You're not allowed to say anything ugly. Well, free speech means that you can say ugly things if you want. Again, you're not free from the repercussions of those things, but you should have every right to say those things, whatever they are. Free speech. All right, so as far as comparison to modern politics goes, there's not a lot that we're doing that aligns with Bastiat's principles. However, there's a lot where we diverge from his principles, right? The expansion of government roles has been going on since government has existed. Government has tried its best to grow into the behemoth that it is today. And now welfare, people, now I don't say universal health care positively. That's a negative thing when I'm saying it, folks. Because understand the welfare state and the universal health care and income redistribution via Social Security even, but via taxes. All that stuff is bad. And you all are thinking, oh, Edgar, you hate poor people. Well, it's saying the same applies to the expansion of government via corporate bailouts and via subsidizing one business over another. That is modern legal plunder, 100%. Devaluing our dollar through inflation, that is legal plunder. Foreign aid is legal plunder. You know what? I love sports. Oh, no, I don't love sports. I love minor league baseball. There's a difference there. And I disagree that taxpayers should foot the bill, even part of the bill, for a new baseball stadium. I don't think that is the taxpayers' job. It's not the government's job to step up on behalf of the taxpayer to get a stadium in town, right? These teams have plenty of money, plenty of benefactors. So I disagree with that. And I disagree with that on every level, minor league, major league, whatever, football, whatever it is. So that's just another form of legal plunder. Where else do we diverge? Erosion of individual liberties. That's been happening ever since there's been government, starting with, I want to say one of the very first prime examples of that was the Whiskey Rebellion. But now we have surveillance. We're living in a surveillance state now, especially after 9/11, especially after the Patriot Act and I think whatever this big bill, whatever the bill is everybody's fighting over right now, I'm pretty sure there's even more surveillance packed in on top of that. Regulatory overreach with all these agencies. All of these unconstitutional agencies that exist, as opposed to putting something up for a vote to get some kind of law passed for whatever it is they work with, they simply write policy and then hold you to their policy, whether it's constitutional or not. And I'm thinking EPA right now, but there's ATF. There's many of them. Erosion of individual liberty. I'll give you another example where the government has taken an inherent right and then created some kind of license out of it so that you know how to pay a fee to exercise your right. And that's happened with many of these states, that you have to get a concealed carry permit. Oh, well, you can freely go buy a gun, but you can't carry it unless you have a permit. So they're basically charging you to use your rights. But I'm going to go even further and say that professional licensing. And I want to give an example, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm throwing it out there, and somebody could double check me on it. I believe that a hairstylist has to go through more hours of training than a new police officer. I believe that's the case. Why? Why exactly? I can understand a cop having to go through a whole bunch of training. I can't understand a hairstylist. Well, Edgar, if the government doesn't regulate it, then everybody's going to have an ugly haircut. Well, holy shit, man. Like, you go to the place, you get a bad haircut, and you don't go back to the place. The hairstylist either improves or they lose business and go out of business. Is that oversimplified? Yeah. Professional licensing. Yeah, I guess commercial driver's license. I don't know, man. There's so many different things. Yeah, an 18-wheeler is what, a big 20,000-pound death machine behind if somebody's driving who don't know what they're doing. But I don't know about the hairstylist. I don't even know about having to get a business license for any reason. At any rate, sorry, sidetrack. Erosion of individual liberties. What's another? Tax code. That's legal plunder. Taxation is theft. It is legal plunder, like point blank. And the tax code is so convoluted that your average Joe can't sit and read it and make sense of it. And that's why we all go to H&R Block. We got our tax guy. We got tax lawyers that have to do our taxes for us. It's madness. It's absolute madness. But that's yet another version of that. So we have definitely not taken Frédéric Bastiat's philosophy to heart. At one time, yes. And then what else? Where else? On a global scale, you have crony capitalism, where politicians and big business, are literally in bed together doing disgusting things, costing you money. And then the lobby, the whole lobby system where special interests can get their meat hooks via money. None of that is within the vision of Bastiat's The Law as a neutral protector. The law should protect your rights and only your rights. Individual rights. It should not then tip the scales toward the corporations and whatnot. All right. I've talked about Frédéric Bastiat a little bit here. Now I'm going to slip on over and talk about this next guy. And then we'll come back to Bastiat. For those of you who read a little bit of history, you may have read Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. And he wrote that just based on observations of America in the early 1800s. And I think Tocqueville, I think he loved America. He was French as well, but I think he loved America, really. And so we'll compare his theory a little bit against Bastiat's, and then we'll look at how some of those things resonate in American politics. So recapping on Bastiat, right? Life, liberty, and property are inherent natural rights that the law's only job is to protect those. Limited government, and literally the only scope is to protect individual rights, contract disputes, that sort of thing. And then legal plunder, right? Getting rid of legal plunder, being aware of it, and ensuring that it doesn't go unchecked. And then the law had to have some moral foundation that aligned with individual justice, individual freedom. And everything that it was definitely not in line with any socialism or collectivist ideals at all. And emphasis from Bastiat is on individual responsibility. It's also on a free market. All right. So now let's talk about Alexis de Tocqueville. He believed in equality as a key component of democracy. And for some of you, that will resonate today, right? He believed that democracy should foster social and political equity, and our institutions and culture should reflect that. But at the same time, he warned against tyranny of the majority. But he was acutely aware that the majority can easily suppress minorities' rights. And I mean, you can say majority and minority to mean black and white, or male and female, or business owners and laborers, any of those things, right? Any of those things. So a pure democracy is not good, folks. I know you think it sounds awesome, but anytime 51 can get together and dictate what 49 can do, there's a problem there. Tocqueville emphasized voluntary associations, all right, and that we have codified in the First Amendment, right? But he believed in the power of the local community civic organizations to counterbalance the big centralized power. So he was weary of the centralized power, and he did lean on these community-based organizations, and this is evident by he warned of the risks of centralization, and I warn of it all the time, where soft despotism, he calls it, the bureaucracy, just like it is today. Bureaucracy essentially just erodes any local autonomy. Now, I stand that the original 13 colonies were meant to be 13 independent little countries. And I believe that, but we saw what happens. We became the United States, and that was great and beautiful. We fought a civil war to maintain that union, and now each state lacks any autonomy whatsoever to make their own decisions, because getting that federal money means you're beholden to the federal interests. And all the folks sitting in Washington don't give a rat's ass about Georgia, or about Oklahoma, or Oregon, or Idaho, or anywhere else. They don't care. They only care about DC. And then, so some of those things we just talked about, and again, Tocqueville also emphasized the role of religion or integrity, but he also emphasized civic participation in order to sustain democracy, but again, also to warn against the tyranny of the majority. And that's what happens when you get a big centralized government, and that's where we're at now. That's where we're at now. So let's talk about Tocqueville and and Bastiat, and liberty versus equality. So Bastiat prioritized individual liberty and property rights, and he viewed equality under the law as a byproduct of freedom, right? Everyone should be treated the same under the law. Now, the problem we have today is that wasn't always the case. So there are people who are very mad about that. But at some point, it needs to start being the case. We need to, and I would like to say generally speaking we do, but we all know that there's at least a two-tiered legal system, at least. And that's based on the ruling class and then everyone else. The people who want to be in charge versus the people who just want to be left alone. And Tocqueville saw equality as democracy's sort of linchpin. He believed in the equality, but warns that the equality can undermine liberty if it goes unchecked. And how can equality undermine liberty? Well, when you start trying to force unequal things to be equal, just based on some edict or just based on whatever you base it on. And I can't remember who said it. Some famous philosopher said the greatest injustice is to try to make unequal things equal. Some things just are. Equal opportunity is what we need. You can't force two humans from two different backgrounds and two different belief systems and value systems. You can't force equality on the masses. You can't do it for even a state, of 8 million people, let alone country of 360 million or whatever it is. So equality versus liberty. And then the roles of the government. Again, Bastiat was a minimalist, whereas Tocqueville accepted the broader role of government, but again, caution against centralization. Threats to freedom. So Bastiat's main threat was legal plunder. And folks, you can say what you want about terrorism. You can say what you want about crime. Legal plunder is what's doing us in. Legal plunder is what is killing America right now. Because that's where the money flows. And then Tocqueville, his biggest warning was about the tyranny of majority. Soft despotism through bureaucracy, where the big machine just gets over, and then the bureaucracy and the army, we call it a self-licking ice cream, right? Where you exist to exist. You have to continue existing to keep yourself alive, but there's no other functions coming from that. You're not busy protecting rights. You're not busy doing anything except existing. Civic responsibility. So Bastiat emphasized individuality, individual agency, self-reliance. Tocqueville was very adamant about the power of community and civic participation, which, folks, on a voluntary scale, there's nothing wrong with that at all. When I rail against communism and socialism and all these things, that doesn't mean you can't voluntarily go out, form a collective, a group, and volunteer to do things. You can volunteer to pay more money to the federal government if you want, as long as it's voluntary. But freedom of association, all right, that collective civic engagement, that was Tocqueville versus Bastiat's sort of individual roles there. So both of these guys we've talked about, that their philosophies have an application to today's politics. We may be far beyond it, but the relevance, especially with Bastiat, right, concerns about the legal plunder. That is the thing. That's what Doge was all about, trying to cut the waste. Now, yes, I was in the military, but I can tell you that there's 100% waste, fraud, and abuse going on, and they could cut the military budget significantly. Now, I don't advocate for a weak military, folks. I do advocate for a strong military. I just believe it could be more refined and better managed monetarily. So, application to today's politics, yes, legal plunder, man, overtaxation, all these regulatory agencies, the overreach that they have. That his philosophy applies to that completely. And Bastiat did sort of critique collectivism in contrast to Tocqueville. Now, the collectivism, again, on small community scale, voluntarily, it's not bad. It's good. It's okay. But at the federal level, making broad sweeping decisions for hundreds of millions of people is not bueno at all. And then Tocqueville's relevance to today's politics is that the tyranny of the majority reflects the vast polarization in today's society and today's cancel culture, where the loudest voices will get on the platforms and they seem like the majority, and then they either shame people into capitulation or they straight up cancel these people, based on whatever infraction, whatever thing. And then the centralization that Tocqueville warned of, oh man, it's long since been here. So I think ultimately Bastiat and Tocqueville, their views were complementary of each other, some nuance there. I think both of their philosophies are relevant to today's politics, and it's not because it's ultra simple or simplistic. It's not, and I'll get to some of that in a minute here. But I think both of those philosophies are very good philosophies. Especially Tocqueville. I think his warnings, where social media essentially amplifies the like I just said, the tyranny of the majority, that seems amplified on social media. And then the pressure you get, the cancel culture. Now I think we're starting to slide out of that a little bit, and I hope so. I hope we're starting to slide out of that cancel culture a little bit. All right, so that's a little bit about Bastiat and Tocqueville, and now what I want to do is kind of compare and contrast those two philosophies with not just modern politics, but now modern libertarian principles. Because there is plenty of core principle overlap there, for sure. Libertarianism clearly, obviously champions individual liberty, property rights, minimal government. And that's right on board with old Fred Bastiat there. Opposition to legal plunder. Libertarians critique anything that spends taxpayer money. I don't care if it's a welfare program or if it's corporate subsidies or if you're trying to get the electric vehicle tax credit that they had, all that stuff, man. Anything that costs taxpayer money, the libertarians are against it, and that's it. And especially taxation, all taxation. What else? Non-aggression principle. That's a big platform principle there for the libertarians, which aligns directly with Bastiat's view that the law should only prevent harm, not try to enforce positive obligations. So when the IRS gets a bunch of armed troopers to come knock on your door, that is not, I say again, is not what our government should be doing. Then, of course, advocating free markets, right? Libertarians are all about the free market, the true free market, laissez-faire economics. Libertarians oppose tariffs, over-regulation, all those things, which is very much in line with Bastiat. In what ways does the libertarian principles differ or diverge from Bastiat? Well, any of you who know anything about libertarians know there's about a million subsects of libertarianism. So whereas an anarcho-capitalist, for instance, might advocate for no government, you have minarchist libertarians who kind of advocate for just small government, right? So that's slightly different from where Bastiat definitely didn't advocate for no government, but more in line with minarchists as far as small, very small. in practical application, the libertarians sometimes, there's a joke out there, and I can't remember exactly how it goes, but nobody hates libertarians more than libertarians. Because there's a lot of guys who, they want to push this real ideological purity, right? I don't want to say extremism, but just the purity of the ideal. So, but that's very difficult. Bastiat was a little more practical about that, a little more pragmatic about that when it came to focusing on economics. You can't really be a purist and get too far in government. There has to be some kind of compromise. So, yeah. And then some modern libertarian challenges, like what? There are so many things today that didn't exist in Bastiat's time. So his idea of the law, if you read it, it might seem somewhat outdated, but really it's not. It all applies. And also, Bastiat was, libertarianism didn't exist back then. Bastiat was what you would call a classical liberal. And his philosophy had actual support. There classical liberals of that time agreed wholeheartedly with. But some of the more complex things that have come along since his time, like immigration, for instance, dealing with intellectual property, just the internet, free speech on the internet, things like that. He didn't touch on those things because they obviously didn't exist. But I think the general idea you can get a good idea of where he would have went on certain things like that. Libertarianism, libertarianism, like Bastiat, definitely condemns government overreach. I'll give you a good example. A modern example is the war on drugs. It's been a miserable, colossal, epic failure. That's it. So the government, they ginned up the war on drugs, all the while pumping drugs into various places, but to have cash, man. I don't want to get too deep, but and then also libertarians condemn, much like I think Bastiat probably didn't directly talk. Well, he did in the law. If you read it, he directly did. Is unnecessary military interventions, especially going to war without Congress voting on it. What else? Libertarian, in line with Bastiat, oppose or criticize fiat currency and the central banking system, ergo the Federal Reserve. Obviously, in Bastiat's view, the Federal Reserve just enables legal plunder. What is the Federal Reserve but a counterfeit machine that was voted on? It was voted on in 1913. All right. What are some contrasts and tensions between modern politics versus the sort of Bastiat libertarianism? It always comes down to individualism versus collectivism, doesn't it? Individualism versus collectivism. Modern policies, it's all about sort of these big group outcomes. Social justice, man. That's what's going on. Social justice. All these climate things. Is climate change a hoax? No, man. Is the government response to climate change a hoax? Well, a shambles? Yeah, absolutely it is. They put those things ahead of individual rights. And that's in direct contrast to libertarianism and Bastiat. And then you got pragmatism versus principle. So what's practical versus what our principles are? Politicians prioritize what? Yeah, getting voted in on the next cycle. That's literally all they care about. And padding their own pockets. You're not going to convince me otherwise. There's very few that have the integrity to actually be leaders of America. So yeah, politicians are going to do what will get them elected. They don't stick with their philosophical, even party platforms sometimes. Yeah. Complexity of the modern economy here, globalization, technology. These things all lead us down the road to a one world, government, a big global government. And I love technology, man, but the government is that's where they're going. And if we don't get a handle on protecting our data, it's not going to be long before that's exactly what we are, is one world freaking government with a bunch of, what do you call them? Subjects. We're just going to be subjects. How can libertarian party, libertarianism, how can it evolve beyond Bastiat and still hold on to those principles? Some of the modern issues in the libertarian, sort of sphere is like cryptocurrency, for instance. That's a big deal. Net neutrality. But a lot of technology has crept its way into politics. And those obviously extend beyond Bastiat's, day. But we can apply the same principles still. Just because the technology is there doesn't mean the principles weren't sound, and it doesn't mean that our rights change in any way. And then some cultural shifts that libertarians focus on, like legalization of drugs. I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have been an issue for old Bastiat there. But the Libertarian Party focuses on social liberty, right? Legalization of drugs, and some even advocate for marriage equality among the sexes, right? Man on man marriage, woman on woman marriage. I don't advocate that, and I'll tell you why. The only reason I don't is because I don't think the government should be in the marriage business. As far as two men getting married or two women getting married, I care less. If you're in love, and between you and your holy institution, whatever that may be, right on, go be married. I don't think the government has a hand in that. They don't have skin in that game. And I've ranted about this before, but I'm never going to get on board with that because I don't think it's a non-issue. And if anything, I'm on board with deregulating marriage completely. And then as far as public perception goes, these days, I think the Libertarian Party was born in 1972. I think these days people look at, they see on TV and they see like Vermin Supreme with a rubber boot on his head, and they equate that to the Libertarian Party. Or they see a candidate running for office who's a gay advocate, and he seems more like a gay advocate than a politician. And that keeps the party on the fringes. I think it kind of keeps the party on the fringes a little bit. Yeah, I do. So the public perception of the Libertarian Party these days, if you ask anybody on the street about a platform issue, you will probably get a very libertarian answer. But then if you ask them what their politics are, they'll give you red or blue because they don't really know any better. In Bastiat's day, his ideas were mainstream in classical liberalism. And I wish we had that same kind of credibility amongst the masses here with libertarianism. And then modern politics, public perception. I think you see it with this frickin' Israel and Gaza, and then Ukraine and Russia. Interventionism. Libertarians and Bastiat, as well as the Libertarian Party, we're all about anti-interventionism. We are not the world police. We shouldn't go around saving the day, because we don't save the day, by the way. But we're not the world police. I don't think we should be messing around with Ukraine. Not boots on the ground, not giving them weapons or money. I think, being a third-party host for peace talks, sure, great. Offering neutral ground, yeah, for sure. But you could almost classify me as an isolationist. Only almost. All right. As far as relevance and challenges of today, the politics of Bastiat and the current libertarian politics, that as far as Bastiat goes, the core principles endure. All right. The warning against legal plunder. That is as relevant now as it's ever been. Tax policy, subsidies, corporate welfare, public welfare. These are all hot issues and have been at least since 1849, right? At least. And then defense of individual liberty. That is Bastiat's another one of his sort of core principles that is timeless. Individual liberty. Now, as an American people, I don't know that how many people really truly understand what that means. But once you start getting censored and you start getting surveilled on a daily basis, then you'll get it. And so with libertarians and Bastiat specifically, it's not me, I'm not the guy, but I wish we had a figure who is bought into Bastiat as much as I am and could articulate and translate his ideals to today's politics, into mainstream politics. I think that would work wonders for the government. And then I don't hear Bastiat discuss that much, but assuming because everybody in the Libertarian Party already knows who that is and all that, but I think political education is very important, and I think he's a very important one to be educated on. And then what are some barriers to implementing these ideas, what in his time were good and accepted, and in our times would be looked at as fringe? Because we know that the big government is entrenched, right? The bureaucracies are entrenched. The Lockheed Martin is entrenched with the military. Northrop Grumman is entrenched with the government. So these people are going to resist anything anytime you say small government, of course the government is going to resist. And what's another barrier, right? So we got the big entrenched interests. That's a barrier. And then tragically, we got the public being brainwashed and thinking that the government is their solution to everything. Healthcare, education, climate change, etc. And that is in direct opposition of the libertarian and Frédéric Bastiat's core principles. And so what we need definitely is some modern adaptation of those ideas, translate them to the modern, economy, the modern digital economy, modern global trade, and translate Bastiat's ideas specifically, but the libertarian ideas as well. So yes, Bastiat, Tocqueville, their philosophies align pretty closely with libertarian principles, very specifically on individual liberty and the opposition to legal plunder, taxation, those types of things. Modern politics, never mind the libertarians, modern politics diverges significantly due to the vast expansion of the government. So, in closing here, folks, if you read the law, and I strongly encourage you to read it, Frédéric Bastiat, The Law, he offers amazing clarity in defending liberty, right? It's very plainly written, and everything in there, man, is just it's timeless. It spans the different political eras, and it's a framework that could be built upon without much change whatsoever. Yes, you have to modernize a little bit, but not much. But yeah, applying what seems like a very old school philosophy, with the modern complexities and public expectation as well. Like, people are impatient these days. The voting public is impatient. I believe that's why DJT trying to push this big bill, even though there's some significant flaws in that bill. There's some good stuff in that bill, but there's significant flaws. And once again, folks, just in case you forget, the Mills Clean Bill Act of 2025, you better believe that if I was in charge, the big, beautiful bill wouldn't be a thing. It would be a whole bunch of little bills that everybody had to vote on. So, at any rate, Bastiat, Frédéric Bastiat, Alexis de Tocqueville, both French philosophers who experienced America in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, and both had solid philosophies. Tocqueville on democracy in general, with emphasis on civic duty at the community level, and then Bastiat with emphasis on individual liberty and small, minimal government intervention. So think about those. Please go read those guys. Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, and The Law by Frédéric Bastiat. If you're even remotely political, please read those and give it a good critique. Like, read it not just to breeze through it, but read it to really critique. And then, like I've done here, kind of juxtapose it to modern politics and see what can we take out of that. And then if you agree with those philosophies, then go and see which of those philosophies apply to which of the current political parties. Yeah, see who's doing the things that you like, that you read, that you think, yeah, that makes sense, that's good. And who's doing these things? I think you're going to find that your team is not, unless you're libertarian. And so, all right, this has been my political rant. This episode has been essentially a political rant on why we can't do things better. It don't take any new groundbreaking political philosophy, folks, to govern well. There's plenty that has been written that is perfectly good guideline, a perfectly good set of rules to govern off of. But again, we got greedy politicians out there that do what greedy politicians do. So, look here, folks. Thank you for listening. If you have disagree with anything I've talked about, or if you find mistakes in some of the things I've said, please hit me up. You can find us on thejuntopodcast.com, and that's where you can contact me. You can find us on all the podcast platforms. If you like to shoot guns, you can go to ospreyshootingsolutions.com and look around. We got plenty of things going on for June and July. If you are interested in adventure-based leadership and teamwork development, you can find good stuff at 2teamguys.com. That's the number 2, teamguys.com. Everything from situational awareness to land navigation to surviving captivity. We got all kind of stuff over there. And the common threads there, like I said, are leadership and teamwork. We put you in stressful, situations, pretty tough, austere environments, and there's problem solving that has to be done on the fly. And you have to manage personalities and convince people to do the things you need them to do. So it's very good. Teamwork and leadership development. So that's the number 2, teamguys.com. And again, folks, if you want to write a paper, something you feel strongly about, and I'll publish it on the website on the juntopodcast.com, because we do written blogs on there as well. So please go and check out my latest couple of written blogs. And other than that, folks, I appreciate you listening. We're almost to 5,000 now. Hopefully we'll be climbing on up even faster sooner. And again, reach out if you need something. Reach out if you have any suggestions or ideas. I appreciate you guys. I love you guys. Take care.